She had not made a sound in 412 days. Not a word, not a cry, not even a breath. Loud enough to notice the Cathari. Healers called it the stillness, a kind of living death that swallowed survivors. Whole after the burning of the cradle. World, but the human called Marcus Reed didn't know any of that when he first saw her sitting alone in the rain. Outside the colony medbay, soaked through, staring at nothing and looking like someone had reached inside her chest and taken everything that mattered. He just thought she looked cold, so he sat down next to her, and that one stupid, small, thoroughly human decision, that choice to just sit, became the first link in a chain that would eventually give her back something she thought the universe had permanently stolen. Her voice, her name, and something nobody in the galaxy expected her to find again, a reason to smile, to understand what Vale was. You first have to understand what the Cathari were before the burning, and I mean who they really were, not the sanitized diplomatic briefing that the Interstellar Coalition handed to every human colony administrator, but the actual truth of them. The Cathari were, by every measurable standard, the most emotionally sophisticated species the galaxy had ever catalogued. Their neurobiology was structured around something humans don't have a clean translation for. A word in their language, Vathari, which roughly means the state of feeling the full weight of existing, not happiness, not sadness. Something deeper, a constant conscious awareness of being alive, of being connected to others, of being held inside the fabric of meaning. Their faces were built to express it too. Slightly wider cheekbones than a human's. Eyes with a second inner eyelid that flushed iridescent colors when emotion peaked, gold for joy, deep violet for grief, a burning copper for rage. When a Cathari smiled, their whole biology lit up. You didn't just see it, people standing nearby said they could feel it. A warmth, a pressure in the sternum, like something important was happening close to you. Their civilization had stood for 11,000 years on a world they called the Cradle, a temperate, ocean-ringed planet in the Veen cluster that humanity had only charted, never visited. 11,000 years of art, architecture, philosophy, a dozen wars, a dozen recoveries, a species that had been through the fire and built something worth keeping on the other side. Then the Dominion came. Dominion doesn't get a lot of screen time in the Coalition news feeds because the Coalition has a vested interest in not panicking the 17-member species it's currently responsible for. But what the Dominion did to the Cradle world in the span of 9 days was not a military campaign. It wasn't even a conquest. It was an eraser. Automated weapons, platforms stripped, atmosphere, oceans boiled to vapor. The planet's crust cracked along 3 tectonic lines until the whole world rang like a broken bell. 9 days, 11,000 years of civilization gone. Approximately 12,000 Carey made it off the planet before the end. 12,000 out of a global population of 4 billion. They scattered across the Coalition on whatever ships would take them, and they arrived dazed, grieving, carrying nothing except what they were wearing and the psychological wreckage that comes with watching your entire world die in a little over a week. Vale was one of the 12,000. She was what the Cathari considered young, roughly equivalent to a human in their late teens, maybe 20 at a stretch. She had been studying something their culture called deep pattern weaving, which is the closest thing to an art form and a spiritual practice, and a scientific discipline all at once, the practice of tracing the long threads of connection between living things and finding meaning in the places they intersected. She was good at it, her teachers said. She had the kind of mind that didn't just observe connections, it felt them. The same way a musician doesn't just hear a chord but understands it in their body. She lost her parents on the cradle, she lost her teachers, she lost the specific archive city where her discipline was taught, a place that had stood for 800 years and took 17 seconds to stop existing. She lost the ocean she had grown up next to, the sound of it, the smell of it, the way it looked at low tide when the water pulled back in, exposed the old tide-carved stone beneath. She lost the sky she'd been born under. She lost the specific quality of light that only existed on that one planet in that one atmosphere, produced by that one star. She made it to a refugee transport. She sat down. She didn't speak, and in 412 days since then she hadn't spoken once. Here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy consistently gets wrong. Every other species in the coalition had a protocol for the Cathari refugees. Every other species had a framework, a cultural procedure, a diplomatic structure for how to handle beings in crisis. Humanity had none of those things. What humanity had instead was a guy named Marcus Reed who brought an extra ration pack because it was raining. And she looked hungry. That's not a metaphor. That is literally what happened, and that is exactly why it worked. Marcus Reed was not a remarkable man. He would have been the first person in the room to tell you that, and he'd have said it with a grin that made you think he was secretly fine with it. He was 31 years old, originally from a mid-sized agricultural settlement on Kepler 442b, one of those second-generation human colonies where the work is constant, the weather is indifferent, and people develop a specific kind of bone-deep practicality that doesn't have a lot of room for pretense. He'd done a 4-year stretch with the Coalition Defense Forces, not out of patriotism exactly, but because it paid well and got him off-world, and he'd spent most of that time doing infrastructure and logistics work on frontier postings rather than anything that made him feel like a soldier in any cinematic sense. When his contract was up, he'd taken a civilian posting on Vane Station 7, a mid-tier Coalition resettlement facility orbiting a gas giant in the outer Vane cluster, which had become one of the primary processing hubs for Cathari refugees. In the months after the burning, his job title was Colony Integration Coordinator, which in practice meant he was the person who made sure the power grids didn't fail, the food dispensaries were stocked, the medbay had what it needed, and the 437 small practical crises that occurred every week on a refugee station got resolved before they became large, impractical catastrophes. He was good at his job precisely because he didn't overthink it. He showed up, he looked at what was in front of him, and he did the next right thing. That was his entire operating philosophy. It wasn't sophisticated, it worked. He'd been on the station for 3 months when he first noticed Vale. She sat in the same spot outside the medbay every day from approximately the 3 hour after dawn until the station's artificial night cycle began, rain or shine, and the station's atmospheric processors had a tendency to produce a light, persistent drizzle in the outer residential ring. something to do with moisture regulation, that nobody had gotten around to fixing. She sat in it. The medbay staff had flagged her in the system as a stillness case, one of roughly 40 Cathari on the station who had simply stopped functioning in any communicative sense. Following the trauma of the burning, the healers were working on them. There was a protocol. It was slow. Marcus didn't have a protocol. He just noticed that she was soaking wet, sitting on a metal bench without a covering, and that the ration dispenser nearest to her position had been malfunctioning for 6 days in a way that meant anyone in that section of the outer ring was getting 70% of their allocated nutrition. He knew this because fixing the dispenser was on his list and he was 3 days behind on his list. So on day 1 he brought her a ration pack. He set it on the bench next to her. He said, "The dispenser nearby is broken. I'm sorry. I'll fix it by end of me week." And he left. On day 2 he brought 2 ration packs and a folded thermal sheet, the kind the medbay gave out, lightweight, reflective, designed to hold body heat. He put the thermal sheet around her shoulders without asking, not in a dramatic way, just matter-of-factly, the way you'd put a coat on a chair. He said, still working on the dispenser, and he left. On day 3 he didn't say anything at all. He sat down next to her on the bench, ate his own ration pack, put a second one within her reach, and watched the artificial rain come down for about 20 minutes. Then he stood up, said, "See you tomorrow," and left. He did this every day for 37 days. He didn't try to talk to her. He didn't try to help her heal or process or recover. He wasn't performing kindness for an audience. He just showed up, sat with her, made sure she had food, and left. On day 12 he brought a second thermal sheet because it seemed colder than usual. On day 19 he brought a small portable awning from the supply bay, the collapsible kind used for outdoor equipment storage, and set it up over the bench so the rain didn't hit them directly. He called it the world's smallest infrastructure project to nobody in particular, and went back to work. Nobody in the station's diplomatic office would have approved Marcus' approach. No xenocultural liaison would have signed off on it. And honestly, if you described his method to any Cathari healer at the time, they probably would have told you it was too simple to matter. But simple is not the same as small, and what Marcus was doing, without knowing the word for it, without having any framework for it at all, was something the Cathari had a name for. He was being Vithari. He was making her feel the weight of still being alive, not by talking about it, not by treating it like a problem, just by being there. On day 37, veils in her eyelids flushed the faintest trace of gold. Marcus didn't see it. He was already walking away. 3 weeks after that first ghost of gold in her eyes, the station got hit by what the engineering crew logged as an unscheduled atmospheric event, and what everyone else on the station called the worst storm in Van Station 7's operational history. It wasn't a natural storm. The station was orbital. It didn't get natural weather, but a cascading failure in the atmospheric processors sent pressure and moisture regulation into a feedback spiral that took 15 hours to resolve, and in the meantime produced something that felt experientially exactly like being inside a violent thunderstorm in the middle of a steel building. The lights failed in sectors 3 through 7. The heating systems dropped to minimal. Emergency bulkheads sealed in the outer ring, which meant about 60 residents, including Vale, were temporarily locked in the outer residential zone without access to the main hub, Marcus being the person responsible for exactly this kind of situation was already in the outer ring. When the bulkhead sealed, running a diagnostics check on the processor array that had been showing early fault warnings for 2 days, he got locked in. With everyone else, he also had a dog. This requires a brief explanation. Marcus had arrived on Veen 7 with a 4-month-old Labrador mix named Gus, technically in violation of the station's live animal policy, which the station administrator had decided to overlook because Marcus was the best infrastructure coordinator they'd had in 6 years, and nobody wanted to lose him over a dog. Gus was a large, loud, entirely ridiculous animal who had somehow become universally beloved on the station in the 3 months since his arrival, partly because he was genuinely friendly, partly because the Cathari refugees, who had no equivalent animal on their world and had never encountered anything like a dog, found him both completely bewildering and apparently impossible to resist. Gus had contributed more to Interesi's rapport on Ven Station 7 than the entire diplomatic staff, a fact the diplomatic staff was aware of and privately unhappy about. What nobody knew, because Marcus had not mentioned it to station administration and had been mildly anxious about for the past 3 weeks, was that Gus was pregnant. Gus was in fact a female dog, a detail that Marcus had gotten wrong initially and that a station veterinarian had corrected with a level of professional exasperation Marcus thought was excessive under the circumstances. And on the night of the storm, somewhere in the middle of hour 8 of the atmospheric event, with emergency lighting casting everything in orange and the walls vibrating with pressure, Gus went into labor. Marcus had zero experience with this. He had a basic reference guide downloaded on his Riskcom that he'd been reading in increasingly stressed increments over the past week as Gus's due date approached. But reading about it and doing it in the middle of a station crisis with inadequate lighting and no veterinary backup were 2 different things entirely. He set up in a small maintenance alcove in the outer ring corridor out of the main flow of anxious residents, warm enough, decent access to the emergency supply kit on the wall. He got Gus settled on a folded thermal sheet. He pulled up his reference guide. He looked around to see if there was anyone nearby who might know what they were doing. There was nobody nearby except Vale. She was standing about 4 m away at the edge of the alcove, watching. He hadn't expected her to follow him. She had, he realized later, probably followed him out of something close to habit. 37 days of sitting next to him had apparently established pattern in her that even the shock of the storm hadn't broken. She was standing there, arms at her sides, watching Gus with an expression Marcus Bewell couldn't read. He said, "I don't suppose you know anything about this," without expecting an answer, just talking the way he always did, filling the space without pressure, without demand. He'd learned that from the 37 days on the bench. She didn't respond to questions that waited for answers. She responded to presence, so he turned back to Gus. The labor took 4 hours. It was objectively a mess. Marcus managed reasonably well for someone who had no idea what he was doing. He kept Gus calm. He got the first pup out without Incident, the second followed 20 minutes. Later, by the time the third arrived, he was exhausted and beginning to feel the particular emotional weight of watching something be born in the middle of something catastrophic and something in. His chest was very full. He didn't notice when Vale moved closer. He noticed when she knelt down. She moved with a deliberateness that was almost formal, not hesitant exactly, but conscious, like each movement was a choice she was making rather than a reflex. She knelt beside him on the alcove floor. She looked at the three pups arranged against Gus's side, small, wet, extraordinary in their aliveness, squeaking softly into the orange emergency light. Her inner eyelids moved, not enough to be a flush, just a tremor. Marcus watched her for a moment. He didn't make it a big thing. He looked back at the pups. Make, he said, I'm terrible at names. I named their mother Gus because I thought she was a boy, so that should tell you everything you need to know about my process. He paused and then he said, if you wanted to name one of them, I would be very grateful. I'm serious. I will take any suggestion, anything at all. He wasn't performing it. He wasn't being strategic. He was genuinely exhausted and genuinely bad at naming things, and there was a person next to him, and it seemed like the natural thing to say. The silence stretched, and then, very quietly, so quietly that at first he wasn't sure he'd heard it correctly, over the sound of the storm still working itself out in the walls, Vale spoke one word. 429 days of silence, and one word. And the thing is, it wasn't just the word itself, it was what it meant in Cathari and what naming means to a species who had spent 11,000 years believing that to name a living thing is to weave yourself into its thread of existence, to connect yourself to its life. She didn't just give the puppy a name, she reached back into everything she thought had been permanently taken from her, and she found one thread left. And she held it. That one word was not a small thing. That one word was the beginning of Vale choosing to still be in the universe. The word she said was on. In the Cathari language, on is a word that doesn't translate cleanly. Closest approximation is something like the light that comes after a storm passes, but even that isn't quite right, because in Cathari the word doesn't just describe the light, it describes the specific feeling of standing in that light after being in the dark, recognition of the contrast, the understanding that the storm was real and the light is also real, and both of those things are true at the same time. It's a word for surviving. It's a word for being allowed to feel the relief of having survived without erasing the difficulty of having gone through it. Marcus didn't know any of that. He heard the word and he said on back to her, slightly mangling the pronunciation, and he said, that's a good name, with the simple conviction of someone who meant it entirely. And he named the smallest of the three pups on right then, formally, with the same matter of fact certainty he brought to everything. Vale's inner eyelids flushed gold, not a tremor this time, a full sustained flush. The deep honey amber color that the Cathari healers had not seen from her in over a year. Marcus saw it. He didn't know what it meant. He thought maybe it was a light reflection. He made a mental note to ask someone later and then forgot, because Gus needed attention and there were two more pups that needed names, and the storm was still going. He named the second one Station because it was born here and he thought that mattered, and the third one 37 because he couldn't think of anything else, and it was the Number of days it had taken him to get from zero to here, which seemed significant in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Vale watched him name both of them and said nothing, but her eyes didn't go dark again. There was still gold there, faint, persistent, like something had been lit and wasn't ready to go out. When the storm cleared, when the atmospheric processors finally corrected and the lights came back in, the emergency bulkheads opened, and the station breathed out collectively. Marcus gathered up Gus and her 3 pups in a transport container he'd rigged from a storage bin and thermal sheets, stood up and looked at Vale. She was still kneeling. She was looking at An, who was looking back at her with the unfocused, determined squint of a creature 3 hours old and already fully committed to existing. He said, "You want to carry her?" Vale looked up at him. He held the transport container toward her, angled so she could reach in and take the small, warm, extraordinary animal she had named. She did. She stood up with An in both hands held against her chest, and she walked out of the alcove and into the cleared corridor, and the Cathari refugees who had been sheltering nearby and who had all heard. Because in a crisis everyone hears. Everything went very still when they saw her, not because of the puppy, though the puppy was remarkable because of Vale's eyes, because they were gold, fully, continuously gold in a way nobody had seen from a stillness patient in 429 days. One of the older Cathari refugees, a woman named Sarah, who had been a deep pattern weaver herself before the burning, one of Vale's teachers, colleagues, walked up to Vale and stopped. She looked at the girl she had known as a gifted student, the girl who had walked into a refugee transport with her mind already half gone from grief, the girl who had sat outside a medbay, the rain, for over a year, saying nothing. She looked at the puppy in Vale's arms. She looked at the gold in Vale's eyes. She said in Cathari, "What is its name?" And Vale said, "Ethan." And then Vale smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It wasn't a joyful, recovered, everything is fine smile. It was a small, precise thing. One corner of her mouth, a slight shift in her expression, a trembling quality to it that held every single thing she had survived. But it was there, it was real, and the warmth of it, that thing, people standing near a smiling Cathari sometimes felt moved through the corridor like something physical. Marcus, walking behind her with the rest of the pups and a very tired Gus, had no idea any of this had happened until Sarah turned around to look at him with an expression that even across the vast gulf of their different biologies, he recognized immediately as someone trying not to cry. And here is where the story stops being just a beautiful moment and becomes something bigger, because what happened next, what Vale did over the following weeks and months, and what she eventually said to the Coalition Diplomatic Assembly on behalf of the Cathari refugees, started all of it with that one word in the alcove. And it started because a human who had no protocol, no training, no cultural expertise, and no particular expectation of being remarkable had simply showed up every day and sat down. Sometimes the most powerful thing one species can do for another is refuse to leave them alone in the rain. The medbay staff updated Vale's status from stillness active to stillness recovering the morning after the storm, based on the accounts of 6 Cathari residents and one very credible report from Sarah, who had been watching Cathari emotional recovery patterns professionally for 30 years and had never seen anything break through the stillness that fast. They brought in the senior Cathari healer on staff, a methodical older male named Dren, who spent 2 hours talking to Vale in their own language and came out of the session looking like someone who had just witnessed something they needed more time to understand. He found Marcus in the maintenance bay, doing routine diagnostics on the atmospheric processors that had caused the whole storm in the first place. He stood in the doorway and watched Marcus work for a moment, then he said in the careful, slightly formal standard that most Qatari used with humans, she told me what you did, fix the processors. Too late, Marcus said, not looking up. That one's on me, not that, Dren said. Marcus looked up. Dren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the Cathari believe that to name a living thing is to participate in its existence, to invite someone to name something you love is to tell them that their thread is still worth weaving. Do you understand what you offered her? Marcus thought about it honestly. Not when I offered it, he said. I just thought I was bad at names. Dren made a sound that Marcus later learned was the Cathari equivalent of a very soft laugh. Yes, he said, that is, I think, precisely why it worked. Vale began speaking again within a week of the storm, not in standard at first, not to most people, but to Dren, to Sarah, and every day in the outer ring where the bench still was and the small collapsible awning was still set up. To Marcus, she spoke slowly at first. She said the names of things she remembered mostly: the ocean on the cradle, the quality of light, the name of the archive city. She said them like she was checking whether they still existed inside her, whether the words still had the weight they'd once had. Sometimes they did, sometimes she had to sit with the weight of them for a while before she could keep going. Marcus listened the way he'd always done. Everything without performance, without agenda, completely present and completely practical. When she talked about the ocean, he told her about the weather on Kepler 442b, the way the rain came in sideways off the eastern plains and turned the whole sky a specific color of gray that he'd never found anywhere else. He wasn't equating their losses, he wasn't minimizing, he was just offering a thread back, something real and particular, and his placed alongside something real and particular and hers. 2 different threads, both worth something. On for her part grew at the rate that puppies do, which is to say remarkably fast, and with increasing chaos. She became Vale's dog in every practical sense within the first month, a detail that the station's animal policy technically did not allow for, and that the station administrator chose not to notice because some situations are larger than policy, and everyone on VN Station 7 understood that. On slept outside Vale's quarters. On sat with Vale on the bench in the outer ring every morning, which meant that Marcus' daily visit now involved both of them and occasionally Sir and sometimes 3 or 4 other Cathari who had started gravitating to that bench the way people gravitate toward warmth. 6 months after the storm, the Interstellar Coalition convened a formal assembly on the question of the Cathari refugees, their status, their rights, their need for permanent resettlement rather than indefinite processing hub holding. It was by all diplomatic accounts a contentious session. 12,000 people was not a large population by galactic standards, but the politics of resettlement, resource allocation, territorial claims, and the ongoing Threat of the Dominion made every decision complicated. The Catherine were permitted to send a representative to speak. They sent Vale. She was not the most senior Catherine on any of the stations. She was not the most politically experienced. She was not, by conventional standards, the obvious choice, but the Catherine community had voted, and the vote had been nearly unanimous, and the reason they gave formally in writing in the coalition record was that she was the one who had found her way back. She had been further into the stillness than almost anyone. They had lost, and she had returned, and she had returned not because of protocol or intervention or anything the galaxy's best healers had managed to provide, but because something true had been done for her by someone who didn't know how to do anything false. She stood in front of the coalition assembly, and she spoke for 40 minutes in clear, precise standard. She spoke about the cradle world. She spoke about what the Cathari were, not what they had lost, but what they were. What 11,000 years had built, what 12,000 survivors still carried. She spoke about the stillness. She spoke about what it felt like to stop being in it, and at the end she said something that went into the coalition record and has been quoted in diplomatic discussions of refugee policy ever since. She said, "We did not need to be fixed. We needed someone to sit down next to us and stay. We needed someone to offer us the ordinary, unremarkable truth that they were still there, and that our existence in their proximity was not a burden they were managing, but a mourning they were choosing. You do not recover from total loss because someone heals you. You recover because someone shows you by the destinacy of their presence that there is still something worth recovering for. That is not a medical intervention. That is not a diplomatic protocol. That is the simplest thing one living being can offer another. It is also, I believe, the most powerful thing in the known universe, and I was given it by a human who thought he was just bad at names. It minimal. The coalition granted the Cathari permanent resettlement rights 14 months. After that assembly, Vane Station 7 was decommissioned as a processing hub and converted to a permanent mixed species residential station, the first of its kind in the outer Vane cluster, and Marcus Reed stayed on as its infrastructure coordinator for 11 more years. He was by every account still exactly as unremarkable as he'd always been. He still showed up. He still did the next right thing. He still had a dog, technically 4 dogs because Gus's 3 pups had all stayed, and naming a thing, as the Keth would tell you, means it's yours. On lived to be 14 years old. She slept outside Vale's door every night of those 14 years in whatever quarters Vale was in, on whatever station or settlement or diplomatic vessel the work took her to. When On died, Vale was on her 3rd posting as a coalition diplomatic advocate, the first Cathari to hold that role, and she took 3 days off, and she sat in the rain for a while, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Then she got back up, because the light that comes after a storm, and the Cathari language isn't the absence of the storm, it's the proof that you survived it, and the Cathari had a word for that because they had always known what it was to go through the dark and find light on the other side, and that knowledge, 11,000 of it, did not die on the cradle world. It came through in 12,000 people, in one girl, in one word spoken into the orange emergency light of a station storm, in the name of a dog, If this story moved you even a little, if there is one moment in it that you want to carry with you, stay with us, because the next story starts in this same universe, and it begins with what Vale found when she went looking for what survived the burning that nobody expected to find. That story is already waiting. All you have to do is be here for